The organ was giving him trouble that morning. James Holloway had been playing at Greater Mercy Baptist Church for 11 years. He knew when an instrument was lying to him. The B-flat key dragged just enough to pull everything a half-second behind, and he spent the first quarter hour quietly working around it, the way you learn to walk around a familiar crack in the floor. It was April 1962. Chicago's South Side had its particular Sunday smell. Wet wool, floor wax, something frying 3 blocks over. The pews filled slowly. Women in church hats, men with shoes polished the night before, old men carrying Bibles rebound with tape. Mahalia Jackson was singing that morning. That alone guaranteed a full house. James had accompanied her a dozen times by then, and he'd learned something about her that casual listeners never quite picked up on. She didn't perform. She remembered. Every song she sang was connected to something she had actually carried. A specific loss, a specific fear, a particular morning when grace was the only thing keeping her upright. The congregation could feel the difference between that and mere technique, and it was the reason they came. Not for entertainment, for the feeling that someone else had already survived what they were currently going through. He was running through the morning's order of songs when the side door opened. James didn't look up right away. Late arrivals were common, but the pew creaked once, and then there was nothing. No shuffling, no whispered apologies, no sound at all. And that particular silence was unusual enough that he turned. A young man sat in the second-to-last row, dark jacket, cap pulled low. He wasn't looking around the way people do when they're somewhere unfamiliar and want to understand the room. He was looking down at his hands, just sitting there, still, like someone who had needed to be somewhere quiet and had finally found it. James recognized him after a moment. He'd seen the face on a record sleeve at the shop on 47th Street. Marvin Gaye, one of Motown's newer names, smooth voice, the kind of voice that moved effortlessly across whatever song it was handed. 22 years old, maybe 23. James had heard one of his singles on the radio and thought, that boy has something real underneath all that polish. He'd wondered, in the idle way of a man with no stake in it, why it never quite came through. He turned back to his organ and said nothing. Mahalia came in from the rear of the church, walking slowly the way she always did, taking in the room before the room took her in. She stopped at one pew to hold an elderly woman's hand for several seconds without saying a word. She greeted 3 people by name. She reached the front, turned to face the congregation, and smiled. Not for anyone in particular, just at the fact of them being there. James played the opening of the first song. What happened in the next 40 minutes is difficult to describe to someone who wasn't in that room, and James had tried over the years, more times than he could count. He always came up short. He could say that Mahalia sang about sorrow and about endurance, and that the combination hit people differently depending on what they'd brought with them that morning. He could say the room changed somehow, though no window was open and nothing on the thermostat had moved. He could say he stopped watching his own hands at some point and just played, which was unusual for James, who was a careful musician and almost always watched his hands. What he noticed most was the young man in the back. Marvin Gaye was not crying the way people cry at concerts. Eyes closed, face tilted slightly upward, choosing to feel something in a room designed for exactly that. He was crying the way people cry when something returns that they had stopped expecting. His shoulders were pulled in, his head was slightly bowed. He was not aware of anyone watching him, which in a room full of people who recognized his face was a remarkable thing to witness. Mahalia finished the third song and reached for her glass of water. She looked out over the congregation the way she often did between pieces, not performing gratitude, just taking stock. And then she stopped. Her eyes had found the back row. She set the glass down without drinking from it. She looked at him the way James had seen her look at unexpected things. Not with surprise exactly, but with a kind of careful attention, the way you look at something familiar and realize you'd been seeing it wrong. She waited several seconds. The congregation, reading her stillness, went quiet. "Young man," she said, "in the back." Every head turned. Marvin looked up. His expression shifted. The private grief closing off quickly, replaced by something more controlled, more practiced. He glanced around to confirm she meant him. She did. "I don't know what brought you here this morning," she said. Her voice was conversational, not theatrical. But I don't think it was to sit in the back row. Soft laughter moved through the pews. Marvin didn't smile. He lowered his eyes for a moment, then stood. He walked to the front of the church, and the room tracked every step. He stopped a few feet from where James sat at the organ, and James could see him clearly now. Younger than the record sleeve, and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Mahalia looked at him without apology or performance. Just looked. "I've heard your voice on the radio," she said. "Yes, ma'am. You can sing." "Thank you." "That wasn't a compliment," she said evenly, without cruelty. "It's just a fact. Plenty of people can sing." She folded her hands. "What I'm asking is whether you know what your voice is actually for." The church was completely still. Marvin didn't answer right away. He looked at the floor, and when he raised his eyes, something had shifted in his face. Less defended than it had been 30 seconds ago, like a door that had been pushed open slightly. "I used to know," he said. "I'm not sure I do anymore." Mahalia nodded slowly, as though that was exactly what she'd expected to hear. She turned to James. "Brother Holloway." He looked at her. "Precious Lord." James placed his hands on the keys. The B-flat still dragged. He played around it, the way he always did. Mahalia stepped back and said nothing more. She simply waited. Marvin turned to face 300 people, some of whom had seen him on television, most of whom had heard him on the radio, all of them watching with the particular attention of a congregation that understood the difference between someone singing at them and someone singing past them. He closed his eyes. He didn't begin right away. James played the introduction through once, and Marvin took one slow breath, and then he started. He sang the way James had heard men sing at funerals. Not to be heard, just to say the words and have them leave the body. "Precious Lord, take my hand." And even those 4 words carried something that made the room shift forward slightly, the way rooms do when something real is happening, and everyone feels it before they understand it. By the second line, one of the older women in the third row had pressed her hand to her mouth. He didn't sing it the way he sang on his records. That voice was beautiful and controlled, and sat inside an arrangement the way furniture sits inside a decorated room, placed carefully, meant to be admired. This was different. This had edges. There were moments where he pushed past what the melody asked for, and moments where his voice pulled back to nearly nothing, and neither of those things felt like decisions. They felt like the absence of one. When he reached the second verse, James stopped watching the congregation and watched Marvin instead. His face had changed completely. Whatever he'd been carrying when he walked through that side door, the composure, the awareness of being recognized, the careful distance that fame puts between a person and a room, was gone. He looked like a man standing in front of something larger than himself, trying to remember how to be small enough to fit inside it. James had seen that expression before, mostly in people who had lost something important and found themselves, months or years later, in a place that brought it back without warning. The last note was not clean. Marvin held it as long as he could and let it go before it was fully resolved. The imperfection of that ending was more honest than a clean finish would have been, and the room understood that without anyone needing to say so. No one applauded. This wasn't that kind of moment, and everyone in that room knew it. Mahalia walked toward him. She took both of his hands and held them. She looked at him for a long time before she spoke, and when she did, her voice was quiet enough that only the first few rows could hear her. James heard because he was close to the front. "Your father taught you that song," she said. Marvin's jaw tightened. "Yes, ma'am." "And you still carry anger at him for other things?" A silence. "Yes," he said. She nodded, not with judgment, but with the recognition of someone who had seen this particular combination before. "The song is still true," she said quietly, "even when the man who taught it to you isn't." She led him toward the small office off the back of the sanctuary. James watched them disappear through the door. He played softly while the congregation gathered itself again. Not any song exactly, just sound, the way you leave a lamp on in a room where something important happened and you're not ready to close the door on it yet. In that office, he pieced together later, Mahalia talked to Marvin about Sam Cooke, about what it costs to divide yourself in two. the sacred self and the one who signs the contracts, and try to keep both of them alive. She told him Sam had believed he could move between those worlds without losing anything that mattered. She did not say what she thought about whether he had been right. She talked about his father and about what it means to carry a theology you resent but can't fully put down, because it was the first language you ever learned and you still think in it even when you're trying not to. She talked about what Chicago's South Side had sounded like 30 years earlier, when the blues and the gospel were the same room with two different doors, and nobody thought there was anything to argue about. Before the conversation ended, James heard one thing clearly through the door that had drifted slightly open. "Whatever success finds you," Mahalia said, "don't let it make you quiet about what you see. A voice that people will follow is not a reward. It's a weight, and you'll have to decide what you do with it." There was a long pause before Marvin answered. James couldn't hear what he said, but when Marvin came back through that door and walked through the sanctuary toward the exit, he stopped once, at the pew where he'd been sitting, and looked back at the room. The expression on his face was not peace exactly. It was something quieter than peace and harder to name. 9 years later, when What's Going On was released in the spring of 1971, James bought it on the day it came out. He played it in his kitchen that evening, alone, the window open to the same South Side streets that hadn't changed as much as people claimed. When the last track ended, he sat without moving for a while. He thought about a young man coming through a side door on a wet April morning, cap pulled low, looking at his hands. He thought about what Mahalia had said through that half-open door, and about the weight she'd described, and about what it means to carry something for 9 years, and finally set it down in front of the whole country. He got up, lifted the needle, and placed it back at the beginning.